Now I've got a little bit of a confession to make in that this video was actually filmed last year as part of Inktober 2023, but for some reason I've only just recently discovered it sitting in my little computer files along with a couple of other Inktober videos that I'd done last year. So I thought what I would do is like a little precursor or taster session for this year's Inktober, which I'm currently in the middle of planning and organising. I thought I'd kind of actually get this video and the other two that I found finally edited and hopefully put up on this channel as like a little warm-up for this year's Inktober. So let past me talk you through the process of creating the artwork for the pieces that I entitled I Dream of Bees. Let's go back in time. It's a little bit like artwork inception. Let's cast our minds back to 1st of October 2023 and I hope you like the video. It's the 1st of October 2023.
So for my first Inktober drawing, I decided to take the prompt words from two different lists and combine them together to inspire my artwork. The first word was dream, which I got from the official 2023 prompt list, and the second word was bee, which was the first word on the peachtober prompt list. Now I don't know whether it's because I've been reading Winnie the Pooh recently to one of my nephews, but the first thing that I thought of when combining these two words together was actually a sleepy little bear who was happily dreaming about some honey and some bees and some beehives and stuff like that. So I began by very lightly sketching out some bears using my mechanical pencil. I wanted to try and explore and develop a basic understanding of the anatomy and structure of a bear, so instead of just drawing a bear sleeping, I decided to draw the bear in a variety of different positions. I felt that if I studied enough different positions it would eventually be easier for me to alter and change the positions of the bear when I came to designing my final composition. You may see that when sketching out the bears I tried to use a variety of different line weights, pressing quite softly when I was trying to get the proportions correct and then pressing a bit more heavier when I was more confident about the marks that I was making on the paper. Even though I was originally inspired by Winnie the Pooh, I didn't really want to end up with a very cartoony looking bear. However, I did still want my final illustration to have like a storybook feel to it because I'm kind of using Inktober this year to develop my storybook like portfolio. So I decided to sketch some bears that were a bit more realistic but also had quite an expressive, kind facial expressions and had like different characteristics and stuff like that. After getting carried away a little bit and filling up a whole sketchbook spread with some simple bear studies, I did at this point remember that the prompt words were meant to be dream and bee. So I started a new spread in my sketchbook, this time focusing on sketching some bears in positions that related back to the original idea that I had. So I first started sketching some bears climbing up the tree to get to the beehive and the bees, and then moved on to sketching out some bears that were fast asleep after filling their tummies with honey. You may notice that I changed from a pencil to a red pen when I was sketching out these studies. This was purely because I was getting bored of sketching in pencil and wanted a bit of colour in my life. However, I did like the fact that the red pencil was softer than my normal mechanical pencil, which meant that I could get some more softer marks and some different variety of line weights and stuff like that. And finally, to fill up the second sketchbook spread, I did also decide to do a few bee studies and some beehive studies just so that I had an understanding of all the elements that I might want to feature in my final illustration. Now I'm not going to lie, at this point I was beginning to panic a little bit as I basically had a lot of sketches and a lot of ideas, but I hadn't really narrowed anything down yet and it was getting quite late into the night. So I decided to turn back to the first spread in my sketchbook, trying to think of ways that the bears could interact with some bees. As I said, at this point it was getting quite late into the night and I didn't really feel like drawing very complicated bees, so I basically just grabbed a yellow alcohol marker and drew some little blobs to indicate where I could put the bees. Looking at both the spreads as a whole, I began to realise that because I'd drawn so many bears I could actually make like a little story sequence out of them, as if I was going to like do an animation about the bear. So because of this I basically started formulating like a story idea in my head and I began thumbnailing an idea of series of illustrations that told a story that I was coming up with. So I proceeded to grab some tracing paper and started to work on top of the studies that I'd done in my sketchbook, slightly adjusting the position of some of the bears so that they looked like they were interacting with some of the bees a bit more. So for example, with the first bear I adjusted his head a little bit more so that it looked like he was looking upwards as though he was staring at some of the bees overhead. So once I traced over and adjusted the bears that I wanted to keep from my first illustration, I wiggled and jiggled the tracing paper around a little bit until I found a layout that I was happy with. I then taped the tracing paper together and took it over to my light box to trace it onto some spare scrap paper. I ended up using an A2 piece of paper, not gonna lie, for the life of me I do not know why I chose such a big piece of paper. No wonder I always struggle to complete these little art challenges, but anyways. Back at my desk I began doodling into the design with a black biro pen, gradually working into the piece with bees and flowers and a tree bee and some beehives just to fill up the composition a little bit. Part of the story that was inspiring me was the idea that the bees were leading the bear to their beehive where he would ultimately find some honey. So I decided to play on that idea a little bit by trying to make the layout of the composition look like a trail map. At this stage I decided to spend a bit more time focusing on planning out some colours. Grabbing some of my nephew's basic colouring pencils, I basically came up with a simple colour scheme that I felt looked bright, young and playful. At this point I also remembered the stamps that I'd used in my sketchbook spread earlier and decided it would be a fun idea to stamp the word start and finish onto the concept, partially to fill in some gaps on the design, but also because I thought it linked back nicely to the idea that it was a trail or a map or like a board game or something like that. Then for some reason I decided to create even more work for myself in this video by composing a few more illustrations that I thought would help depict different parts of the story that I'd created in my head. So I basically used the same techniques as I did before, i.e. grabbing some tracing paper and then transferring the sketch onto a separate piece of paper and then ultimately sketching and doodling into the pieces to develop the designs further, and then I went on to plan out the colour schemes. Okay, so quick little update. Number one, it has actually just started thundering and raining here as I'm filming this. Sorry if you get like a few thunder scares. I have basically ended up coming up with like a little short story or like a little poem to go with the illustration that I was kind of thinking of, and then I've kind of sketched and planned out a few little illustrations that then help tell the story as well. My main idea for the story was that it's like a little bear who's very hungry, so he's like having a bit of a dream and a daydream about some bees coming along and helping him find some honey. I kind of wanted them to look very like whimsical, a little bit childlike, maybe a little bit like dreamlike, which is why I've got like loads of blues and yellows and pinks and stuff like that in it. And also I really wanted it to be quite like a bright, happy series of pictures until you get to the end where it's a bit more dull and dark and a bit grayscale. And I think the key thing is there's not going to be any yellows in the last illustration because he's meant to be very, very grumpy, that he has got grubs instead of honey, which I think if I was a bear I'd probably be a bit grumpy if I had grubs instead of honey. Although actually I think probably bears in real life would actually quite like grubs and insects, but in this little poem he definitely is not a fan. He wants to have honey. Yeah, so let me just quickly read you out the little poem extract that I wrote. Sometimes I write these type of things just to kind of help me come up with an idea and get something to actually like flow a little bit and have a bit of a story behind things. Yeah, it goes: the bear sat alone dreaming of honey. All he wanted was something yummy for his tummy. He'd made himself hungry by playing all day and wished some bees would show him the way. He'd follow the bees to their home in the trees, past the fields of flowers with their giant green leaves. He'd have to climb right to the top. It might take a while with plenty of stops, but right at the top he'd be delighted to see a hive full of honey made by the bees. Politely he'd ask them for their sweet runny honey, then fall fast asleep with a very full tummy. But alas, he sat alone in his field of shrubs and grumpily ate some icky sticky grubs. So yeah, that is kind of like the silly little poem that I wrote to kind of help tell the story. So yeah, I'm actually quite happy with this. Now I'm not 100% sure in this video if I'm going to paint all of these illustrations because it's taken me a lot longer than what I was planning to already. But I think I might have a go at painting this illustration properly. So what I need to probably do is draw some of the bears a bit better, especially this one here and probably this little fella down here, and then definitely draw some of the flowers a bit better. Let's go over to the light box and let's get this traced. So after I transferred the concept sketch onto some better, higher quality piece of paper, I then moved on to working on the final piece. So I got out some bright, gorgeous yellow ink and began working into the illustration by painting the bees. Not gonna lie, I was a little bit worried that the yellow ink would end up picking up some of the graphite from the pencil, so I began by lightly rubbing out some of the bees. I decided to do this fairly gradually because I didn't want to lose some of the bees on the actual final composition. Painting the bees did take quite a long time and I was going a little bit stir crazy, but I loved how simple and bright the yellow was looking and just the fact that it was kind of making like a little map across the paper. At this point I actually couldn't decide whether to go down the colour route or or stick to a very simple like line art and yellow splodges route, but I eventually decided that I wanted to add some colour, so I then moved on to painting the blue colours in the background, basically because I just wanted to fill out the layout a little bit. You may notice at this point the colour of the blue did vary slightly between each circle, mainly because I stupidly didn't mix up enough of the light blue colour to begin with, and I was gradually running out of paint as well. So not gonna lie, I was a little bit annoyed at myself for this rookie error, but looking at the final illustration in the present, it doesn't really make that much of a difference, and it's something I could probably easily fix on like Photoshop or something like that. The other major issue that I found when painting the circles was the fact that I didn't really have a very thin brush lying around, and it meant that I had to be really careful painting around the little yellow bee blobs, but with a little bit of time and patience and endless cups of tea, I managed to get around them all. I did also add in a few extra circles that weren't in the original concept sketch. This is because when I painted the background circles, it became very glaringly obvious that there were a few blank spaces that needed to be filled up, so I basically just added a few more circles just to kind of balance out the composition a little bit. So after testing out some colours on a separate piece of paper, I then started painting the flowers in a pale pink colour, trying to make sure that there was some pink in each area of the illustration. And then because all the other colours that I'd used so far were very pastel, I felt like I needed to introduce like a darker colour, so I then mixed up a darker green colour to paint the leaves. I then went on to mix up like an orangey colour that I felt was halfway between dark and light, and then I used the orange colour to add some circles to the middle of the flowers and paint the sign. So once I'd blocked out all the areas that I was planning to add colour to with a flat layer of paint, I decided that I wanted to start adding some details and like shading and line work to the piece. So I picked out a pinky reddy purpley coloured pencil and then began working into the flowers that I had painted on the illustration. I chose a colour that I felt would work well with all the colours that I'd already done on the piece, so I wanted a colour that would be very bright and intense and that would have high level contrast against the pastely pinks of the petals and the greens of the leaves. I'd remembered reading somewhere that when you dream of things, like all the colours in your dreams are really bright and intense and vibrant, so I wanted a colour that would really contrast and be quite intense because I really wanted to bring that idea of a dreamlike state to my work. Also, I quite like the fact that the contrast between the green and the red had a similar feel to when you go and see like a 3D movie at the cinema and have to put them silly glasses on. You may notice that I used a pencil to write the words start and finish onto the piece, trying to make it look like the words had been stamped. In hindsight, I don't really think this worked particularly well, and I probably should have just used my actual stamps to do this, but I didn't have the right colour ink in pad, and also by this point I just kind of got into the flow of using my coloured pencils. Also, I was a little bit worried about getting the stamp placement wrong and felt like I had a bit more control with a pencil as well. I didn't really have a specific technique when I was adding shading to the petals and leaves. I just basically scribbled and layered marks until I felt like each flower had enough shading and detail on them. So once I'd gone round adding shading to the petals and leaves, I felt like they were looking a little bit too flat for my liking, so I started adding some highlights to each of the flowers using some white paint. You may not be able to notice it in this video, but because I'd done the shading layer with a water soluble pencil, the white paint would often pick up some of the colour pigment and subtly mix with it. I really loved this effect as it subtly introduced some more variance in colour to my illustration. After adding the highlights to the flowers and adding a few more strands of grass to the illustration, I then moved on to working into the bears. At first I couldn't quite decide whether to paint the bears using watercolour paints and go down a bit more of like a whimsical feel, but I ended up deciding that because this art challenge was originally about developing inking skills, that I should probably practice using pen to make art, so I grabbed a blue biro and then started working into each of the bears. Not gonna lie, part of me did start to wish that I'd done watercolour bears, so I might end up doing that in the future. I decided to use a blue biro pen just because I felt like it balanced out the colours that I'd already used in the piece. I was fairly happy with how each of the bears ended up looking, but I do wish I'd spent a bit more time focusing on like the different directions of fur in the bear, and I was a little bit heavy-handed with my shading originally, so the bears ended up looking quite dark and lost a few highlights. And finally, I decided to shade the tree and the beehive. Not gonna lie, at this point I sort of wish that I'd left this piece as it was. I was actually really liking it at this point, and I think from here on in it becomes a little bit overworked, but hey ho, you never know until you try. But yeah, at this point I decided to start adding some details to the bees using a variety of different pens to add the stripy parts and the wings. I also was still not very happy about the differences in colour in the blue circle, so I tried to fix that by grabbing a greeny blue Crayola colouring pencil to try and even out some of the circles, but to be honest I don't think it really made that much of a difference overall, although it did add quite a nice little texture to the circle, so I guess it wasn't an entire loss. I then for some reason decided to grab some shiny silver paint and and paint some lines indicating the flight path of each of the bees. Now, I'm not going to lie, I really regret doing this. I think it would have been okay if I had like a thinner paintbrush or perhaps use like a metallic pen, but the lines ended up being a bit too thick and overpowering, and yeah, it just wasn't really subtle enough. So yeah, not very pleased with this bit, but never mind. One of the last things that I decided to do with the illustration was paint a few little subtle clouds to the blue circles, just to add a bit more texture and to break the shapes up a bit. And then to tie the whole piece together, I then grabbed a black fine line pen and went around the whole illustration, adding a few lines and details and finishing touches to the illustration. So once this illustration was completed, I then decided to work on a couple more of the illustrations that I sketched out that I thought best showed the story of the silly little poem that I'd written. So I began by working on the illustration that showed the bear asleep in the tree covered in honey after having his little snack. I decided that I wanted to keep the colour theme for this similar to my first illustration, as it was still meant to be part of the bear's like dream. So I approached the process of painting it in a very similar way, beginning by blocking out the basic colours and then going through and adding shading and highlights and details with coloured pencils and pens. I think the only main issue that I had was that the blue circle background was a lot darker than the backgrounds in my first illustration. I also don't really like the honey on the bear's mouth, but overall I do think it's quite a cute little illustration. The last illustration that I worked on in this video was the illustration which was meant to depict Mr. Bear grumpily sitting in his field of shrubs eating some grubs. To be honest, at this point I think I was getting a bit of like illustration fatigue, and I think it probably shows quite a lot in this illustration. Stuff kept on basically going wrong when I was illustrating it, and I probably should have left it and come back to it another time. There are elements in it that I like I like the faded colours in the pumpkins, and I sort of like the faded colours of the little grubs. But yeah, I don't know, it's definitely not my favourite illustration, but at least I gave it a go. And I do like the fact that the colours definitely show a difference in mood, which is something I want to explore more in my work in the future. So there we have it. I've managed to do 3 little illustrations for Inktober with varying levels of success. I did also sketch out the other 2 that I'd kind of designed, but I decided not to paint them tonight. I might paint them like another little video, or perhaps turn them into a colouring page or something like that. I'd quite like to turn these ones into colouring pages as well. But yeah, I think they're kind of varying success levels. There's areas on all of them which I like, there's areas on all of them that I dislike, and there's areas on all of them that I loathe entirely. But yeah, that's quite a productive Inktober session. So as I quickly flick through the artwork that I've done for this video, I just want to say a quick thank you for watching it. As I said at the start, I do have a couple of more old Inktober videos that I'm going to post over the next couple of days. I am hoping to get a bit further with Inktober this year, so keep your eyes peeled on this channel for videos and live streams related to that, and wish me luck because I feel like I'm definitely going to need it. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon for another arty crafty video. Bye!